Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 143, The Life of Ben Jonson, Part 2. He that is taught only by himself has a fool for a master. Last time, I introduced the life of Ben Jonson with a look at how information about his life has come to us and, thanks to the unreliability of some of those sources and Jonson's own proclivity to emphasise events and bend his story to his own purposes, how some of that may be less than reliable. As you heard, that particularly relates to conversations that he had later in life and which were recorded by William Drummond during Jonson's visit to Scotland. Although the reliability of these statements has been questioned, I will be incorporating some of them into this and future episodes as evidence for his life, thoughts and actions. But please, just be aware that their provenance is a little dubious. So, with that understanding, let's look at what we do know, and I'll try not to put too many caveats in along the way. Let us, as they say, start at the beginning. Ben Jonson was probably born on the 11th of June 1572. Although born in London, his heritage seems to have been from further north, as he told William Drummond. His grandfather came from Carlisle, and he thought from Annandale to it. He served Henry VIII and was a gentleman. His father lost all his estate under Queen Mary, having been cast in prison and forfeited, at last turned to minister. So he was a minister's son. He himself was posthumous born, a month after his father's decease, brought up poorly, put to school by a friend, his master Camden, after taken from it and put to another craft, I think was to be a wright or bricklayer. There are many records of Jonson's in various spellings in that part of Scotland at the time, so although his father is never exactly identified, the heritage seems reasonable. This area of Scotland was borderland, which had been continually overrun by English raids and then recovered by the Scots. So much so, despite the desire of both sides to hold the lands, they became known as the debatable lands. The practicalities of this situation for the locals meant that Jonson's ancestors were people of dubious loyalty in the eyes of both countries, as they understandably tried to appease whoever was their master at the time. But they were also people who were relied on for defence and as such could make a claim to some level of power in the area. They were hard, probably even wild people, forged by the circumstances of their geography. Only a few years before Jonson was born, there are records of an English raid into Scotland in 1570, where 300 villages were burned and 50 castles razed to the ground. The land was, and I quote, wasted far and wide all over Annandale, the territories of Jonson and others. This was just one in a long line of skirmishes, although a particularly serious one. It was years earlier, at the Battle of Solway Moss in 1542, during a similar English raid, that it is likely that Ben Jonson's grandfather was taken from his home in Carlisle as a prisoner. He is noted as being a prisoner of some importance, and it's likely that Henry VIII was trying to take Scottish lords and ingratiate himself with those he felt he could bend to his cause. And so the Jonsons came to London, and in time they dropped the H from their surname to distance their Scottish origins. So, although his grandson likely had some interest in his Scottish heritage, he was a second-generation Londoner, and we might assume not particularly at home in the lands of his grandfather. Scotland was then a Catholic country, so Jonson's grandfather presumably changed religion and his own son followed suit. The trajectory of a courtier losing their position under Queen Mary, having faithfully served her father for a generation or two, is also not unique, and suggests that Jonson's father was not prepared to give up the new religion for the old that Mary was trying to enforce on the population. It also suggests a steadfastness of character, something that can also be said of his son, to a point that would lead them both into troubles with the authorities. Later in his life, Ben would face personal struggles between the two religions, just one illustration of how the religious changes rippled through generations. There are no details about the manner of the death of Jonson's father, but it seems that fairly quickly his mother remarried, and his stepfather became a significant influence on Jonson. The fact that he was a bricklayer and already had two sons who would in time inherit his business, which seems to have been a very successful London-based one, should lead us easily to conclude that Jonson probably had very little say in his choice of profession, at least as far as his stepfather was concerned. That stepfather is quite probably Robert Brett, a member of the Bricklayers Guild, who is recorded as having been involved with construction projects at Lincoln's Inn. Records of amounts paid for these buildings are very large, suggesting that they were major projects, and the success of the Jonson business is further evidenced by the fact that he became both warden and master of the Tilers and Bricklayers Company in the course of his career. Jonson's family, mother, stepfather and two younger half-brothers, lived in Christopher Lane, that ran between the Strand and the River Thames. It wasn't a particularly nice place to live. An open sewer flowed through the centre of the lane and frequently overflowed during bad weather. Records from a slightly later period say that the houses were very poor and could not fetch high rents because of the noise generated by the constant movement of tradesmen and their carts up and down the narrow thoroughfare. So only the poorest people lived there. In the 1630s, a pipe was laid to replace the open sewer, but the area still struggled to become anything but a poor back street. Many residents of Christopher Lane were connected with the building trade and were often employed on works carried out in the name of the Queen and for members of the court. The Strand was becoming a fashionable street to live on, and a number of very grand houses were being built there, so at least there was work nearby. But the western end of the street, around what is now Charing Cross and Trafalgar Square, was still considered a rough part of town, frequented by thieves, prostitutes and drunks. It's likely that both parents lived on until Jonson was in his 30s. A Rebecca Brett is recorded as having been buried at the Church of St Martin's on the 9th of September 1609, just 11 days after the death of her second husband, if this is indeed Jonson's mother. Although we have few details about Jonson's childhood, there is a suggestion that he received some initial schooling, which was most likely with nothing more than a view to him becoming a bricklayer rather than one of the greatest literary figures of his time. Some biographers have placed him in a private school in St Martin's Church, which would have covered English and rudimentary Latin. But the first time he can be traced conclusively is when he enrolled in the College of St Peter at Westminster School. He attended as a day pupil, joining about 40 boarding pupils from 6 o'clock in the morning every day except Sunday until 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening. Attendance at the Westminster School was one of the luckiest breaks of Jonson's life. Under the reforms enacted by Queen Elizabeth, the school was one of the most rigorous grammar schools in England and was building a reputation for not only the study of English and Latin, but Greek as well. Under its headmaster, Edward Grant, and second master, William Camden, the school was both thorough in its attention to the basics of an Elizabethan education and progressive. I won't linger too long on the specifics of the school curriculum, as this is very similar to the type of school days that I've already discussed in the context of Christopher Marlowe and Shakespeare's probable attendance at the Stratford School. Like other grammar schools, the aim of the Westminster School was to develop piety and morality in the pupils, and to encourage the speaking and writing of Latin, and in the case of the Westminster School, also Greek and then Hebrew in later years, through imitation of the Bible and the best authors, particularly those recently rediscovered from antiquity as interpreted by Erasmus and others. Education progressed from the simplest of Latin grammar from an early age right through to more complex and challenging selections of classical oratory, history and moral philosophy by the time the pupils left, ideally for university or a legal or clerical profession. Jonson saying that he was taken from Westminster School means that it isn't certain how far he progressed through the curriculum. In a later epigram, he praised the second master, William Camden, saying, "Camden, most reverend head, to whom I owe all that I am in arts, all that I know." which suggests that he at least made it through to the third or fourth form, where Camden was the main teacher. On the other hand, as Jonson had some familiarity with Hebrew, which wasn't taught until the seventh form at Westminster School, it is possible that he stayed much nearer the end of his natural school days than has otherwise been suggested. None of this can be said with any certainty, as it is quite possible that Jonson taught himself Hebrew at a later date. He was certainly capable of such a feat. Whatever the length of time was that he spent at Westminster School, it is certain that it deeply affected him and instilled in him a love and appreciation for classical literature that he would continue to make good use of until the end of his days. Although the idea of rote learning, the main method of education at the time, is now well out of favour, Jonson himself alluded to it as something that he found particularly effective when he said to Drummond, "I can repeat whole books that I have read and poems of some selected friends, which I have liked, and charge my memory with. Whatsoever I pawned with it while I was young and a boy, it offers me readily and without stops." Exposure to theatre at the Westminster School included the plays of Terence, like many of the other Elizabethan grammar schools, as part of the teaching of Latin. But the Westminster statutes went further, explicitly requiring the performance of 2 school plays at Christmas. One was to be an English play performed by the cathedral choir boys, the other a Latin play performed by scholars from the school. Although the plays of Plautus were not on the official curriculum, it seems that they were often used for the Latin Christmas play. Records from the 1560s show that the Braggart Warrior and the Wisdom of Solomon, both by Plautus, as well as Terence's The Self-Tormentor, were performed. The twin Menachmi were performed in 1565 in the presence of the Queen herself. Although the performances were probably by the boarding pupils and Jonson would not have been involved in the performance, he would have been in the audience. Not only are his future works full of Plautine and Terentine references, but also many ironic and some simply truthful remarks by various characters about the influence of plays on the school curriculum. Given these references, some of which are very detailed, there can be no doubt that school instilled the love of Roman drama in Jonson, and he no doubt deepened his understanding of it once he had left school by his own methods. It probably does not go too far to say that his love of irony, comedy and intrigue goes back to his early reading of Plautus and Terence in his school days. But like other Elizabethan grammar school boys, his influences also came from other Roman poets who were studied: Cato, Martial, Catullus, Ovid, Horace and others. And before we can leave Jonson's school days behind him, there has to be a further mention of his most influential master, William Camden. Unlike the headmaster of the school, Camden, it is said, relied less on whipping boys and preferred to teach by example of his own scholarship. He was probably working on his history of England, called Britannia, while Jonson was at the school. In its time, this work was much admired for the thorough approach with which he examined the different regions of the country and their history. In the process, he rejected many of the more mythical elements of English history that had been commonly accepted since the writings of Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 12th century. Part of his study for the work was to get a good grasp of both the Anglo-Saxon and Celtic languages, as he immersed himself in English history. Furthermore, he would take pupils on field trips to examine Roman remains and retrieve artefacts, no doubt bringing the classical period alive for his pupils and stimulating their interest further. As Jonson said of Camden in an epigram which is adapted from Pliny, "What name, what skill, what faith hast thou in things? What sight in searching the most antique springs? What weight and what authority in thy speech? Man can scarce make that doubt, but thou canst teach." Camden also left his mark on Jonson's working practice. In his conversations with Drummond, he said that he wrote all his verses first in prose, for so his master Camden had learned him. An interesting technique, and it is thought one that suggests Camden encouraged poetry written in English as well as Latin. Camden was, perhaps, the father that Jonson hoped his own would have been, scholarly rather than practical, and encouraging of literary ambitions rather than those of a trade. It's also been suggested that Camden continued to show an interest in Jonson after he had been forced to leave school. Whatever the case, Jonson's lifelong gratitude to his former teacher is clear throughout his work. So the exact why and when of his departure from Westminster School remains elusive, and the next stage of Jonson's life is also hard to track. The assumption is that he was taken from school either for financial reasons or simply because his stepfather wanted him to begin his apprenticeship as a bricklayer. Later in life, Jonson suggested that he had little love for his stepfather and none for his trade, and perhaps the resentment started at this point. Even before the Drummond Conversations were rediscovered, there was a tradition that Jonson had been a bricklayer for a time before taking up with the theatre. A tradition derived from the taunts of critics who, when they disliked his work, were quick to point out his lowly origins in that trade. Jonson himself was dismissive of his time as a bricklayer, perhaps suggesting that it had been a very brief interlude. But it seems quite likely that he spent longer than he liked to admit at the trade, working intermittently at it across several years. Thomas Fuller included Jonson in his Worthies of England, published in 1662, and places Jonson working with his stepfather, raising buildings at Lincoln's Inn, suggesting that, when having a trowel in his hand, he had a book in his pocket. John Aubrey, in Brief Lives, went further, telling us that while Jonson was working on the garden wall at Lincoln's Inn, next to Chancery Lane, that a knight, a bencher, walking through and hearing him repeat some Greek verses out of Homer, discoursing with him and finding him to have a wit extraordinary, gave him some exhibition to maintain him at Trinity College, Cambridge. There is no record of Jonson attending Cambridge, just a tradition that he attended for a few weeks before being forced to return to his stepfather's employ in straitened financial circumstances. It was again Thomas Fuller who recorded this piece of information, which, although unsupported, means we can't ignore it, as Fuller had written a history of the university and his own father was a fellow there while Jonson would have been in attendance. So it seems unlikely that Fuller would have made such a statement without the verification from his father or his own intimate knowledge of the college. This assertion is further strengthened by the fact that in 1615, the president of St. John's College asked Jonson to pen a poem to celebrate the visit of King James to the college that March. As the king would have visited most, if not all, of the Cambridge colleges during that visit, the fact that Jonson was invited to write for just one of them suggests that he had an association, however brief, that the president was leveraging to persuade the by then well-regarded poet to create something for the king and his alma mater. Fuller then reports that Jonson spent time in London, again working for his stepfather on the large works at Lincoln's Inn. Working hours for a guildsman climbing up through the ranks were long. From March to September, a labourer was required by law to be at work at or before 5 o'clock in the morning, and to not be released until 7 in the evening, the only saving grace being breaks provided for eating and a little rest. It was a schedule that certainly didn't leave much time or energy for study or for a budding poet and writer. It must have been on Jonson's mind to find a way to escape from a lifetime of bricklaying. Things took a decisive turn in the autumn of 1594, when Jonson signed up for military service in the Netherlands. This was the period when England controlled 3 towns as collateral for loans that Queen Elizabeth had made to the Protestant states as they attempted to oust their Spanish masters. The war in the Netherlands was dragging on. In fact, it was a conflict that would continue for 80 years until the Dutch finally gained independence, and when in 1585 the Spanish appeared to be gaining an upper hand, Elizabeth had little choice but to reluctantly agree to provide some assistance. The Treaty of Nonsuch agreed that the English would send an army of 5,000 infantrymen and 1,000 cavalry, on the proviso that England was fully compensated once the war had been won. Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester and a favourite of the Queen's, headed up the army, but soon displeased Elizabeth by accepting the position of Governor-General, making the English intervention rather more official and obvious than Elizabeth would have liked, and then by proving fairly inept militarily. It was a campaign that provided many stories of the heroic deaths of English soldiers and gentry, stories that Jonson would have heard during his childhood. So, with the conflict still grumbling on in the early 1590s, and during a period when England was trying to boost their presence there, Jonson may well have seen glory in battle preferable to laying bricks. Jonson was probably sent as part of the garrison of one of those towns, and he seems to have been very proud of his service. To Drummond he said, "In his service in the Low Countries he had, in the face of both camps, killed an enemy and taken opima spoila from him." Opima spoila suggests that he won battle honours by killing an enemy commander in single combat, played out before the opposing armies. Such military traditions belonged more in the Roman and medieval periods rather than the Elizabethan, so it's very probable that Jonson is exaggerating here. More likely, he found the life of a soldier in a campaign where decent food and decent clothes were very difficult to come by and disease was rife, well below any romantic expectations that he may have had. In his future works he would continue to praise soldiers, but also satirise them and muse on his disillusionment with warfare. So he was back in London by the 14th of November 1594, which we can be sure about because this is when he married Anne Lewis at the church of St Magnus the Martyr. He was 22 years old at the time, quite young for a man to marry in the period, and as he later confessed that he was in his youth given to venery, so we might guess at the reasons for his early marriage. The only comment left to history about his wife was his assessment that she was a shrew yet honest. It's difficult to know exactly what to make of that, but many have suggested that financial difficulties, perhaps infidelities on his part, and a less than sympathetic attitude to his wife might have been the root cause of difficulties in their marriage. Nevertheless, a son was born not long after the wedding, and there was a daughter produced by the marriage too. Jonson appears to have continued to work in the bricklaying business, as in June 1595 he joined the Tylers and Bricklayers Company, and their surviving records show that he continued to make regular payments to maintain his membership through to May 1611. As a member of the Guild, he was required, on penalty of fines, to attend company meetings and several special dinners held across the year, as well as being involved with the Lord Mayor's procession that was held every year on the election of the new incumbent. What his membership of the Guild does not mean is that Jonson was working as a bricklayer right through the first decade of the 17th century. Although it is possible that he wanted to keep his hand in on the bricklaying trade, it's far more likely that as soon as he started to earn money from his theatrical endeavours, that he gave up the bricklaying, but maintained his guild membership because of the social status and connections that it gave him. The Lord Mayor's shows included a procession along the Thames by barge from the city to Westminster, at which the guilds were represented. After taking the oath of office at Westminster, the return journey was made downstream to Baynard's Castle, while at the same time a procession walked its way through the streets from St Paul's Churchyard to the Guild Hall. A further procession was made after dinner, when the companies returned to St Paul's for Mass and Thanksgiving. Along these routes, dramatic presentations were staged at strategic locations. Each of these was devised by one of the London companies, who competed to outdo each other with spectaculars and innovations. They often used children as their actors, but in time, as the pageants became more extravagant and detailed, professional adult actors were also employed. Entertainments that started as little more than speeches in the first years of Elizabeth's reign developed by the end of the reign of James into presentations that were written by professional dramatists, including some of the best-known names of the time, Anthony Munday, John Webster and Thomas Hayward, among others. Records from October 1604 show that Jonson worked for the Haberdashers' Company to devise the Lord Mayor's show for that year, a task for which he was paid £12. And although there are no records to support it, it seems reasonable to think that the Bricklayers Guild would have made use of the talents of one of their own in the earlier years, getting Jonson to provide poetry and prose for their presentations. Even if he hadn't actually written for them, he would certainly have known these processions very well, having attended them every year. And they, perhaps, gave him the grounding for his future achievements as a writer of masques for the court. Although the setting for the Lord Mayor's pageants and court masques were very different, the two shared the need to present large-scale allegorical theatre that showed God's hand working through the monarch and the benefits of civic and national harmony. Both employed mechanical devices, reminiscent of some of those used from medieval theatre, but which, as I'd mentioned, became more and more intricate as the years progressed. The two forms more or less merged on the occasions when the king progressed through the capital and pageants were staged for the benefit of His Majesty and the court. Again, Jonson himself is recorded in 1604 as having devised part of the king's entertainment during the procession for the opening of Parliament. Throughout his career, Jonson continued to write for these entertainments, for the monarch and the livery companies, in addition to his many court masques and his plays for the public houses. John Aubrey claimed that Jonson took to acting as soon as he returned from the Netherlands, but was also by then writing for the theatre. His early attempts at both were not particularly successful. His play Every Man in His Humour was performed at the Curtain in 1598, but there is no mention of Jonson having acted there. And it seems more likely that we should, on the strength of Dekker's satirical comments in Satyromastics, believe that Jonson was, in the first case, primarily a travelling player. We might also surmise from Jonson's own work that he was indeed an unsuccessful actor, and that this happened as part of a travelling company where he played the part of Hieronymo in Thomas Kyd's The Spanish Tragedy. There is also self-reference to Jonson having played the role of Zulsiman in Paris Gardens, one of the London pleasure grounds. The role of Zulsiman remains a mystery, as whatever play it appeared in is now completely lost. It isn't clear what gave Jonson the idea that he could make it as a player. Although he was to become one of its greatest authors, he seems to have had quite an ambivalent attitude towards playing and the theatre in general, at times crying out in despair that it was a place at which nothing but ribaldry, profanation, blasphemy, all licence for offence of God and man is practised. But whatever his reservations, he must have been drawn to the profession. Possibly this was not done out of any reverence for the art, but that he saw the burgeoning theatre as a way to make some money. Better to take that chance than return to the bricklaying. Jonson, we assume, found work as a hired man, the non-sharers of the acting companies, in receipt of a weekly wage. That association with Paris Gardens and some other references strongly suggests that Jonson was a member of Pembroke's men, who toured and acted at the Swan Theatre run by Francis Langley, that was close to Paris Gardens. As you may remember, Pembroke's men were a successful playing troupe in the early history of the Elizabethan theatre, but they had some problematic times and didn't survive the plague years that forced them onto the road. This was the company that in September 1593 had to pawn their costumes in order to make the return to London. They appear to have remained a travelling company, although the details of the years from 1593 to 1597 are very obscure, until they returned to London in an agreement with Francis Langley to play for a year at the Swan. Although there is only proof of Jonson's membership of the company in later years, we might guess that he travelled with the troupe in 1595 and 1596, when he missed paying his fees to the Bricklayers' Company. It is on his return to London with Pembroke's men that we might see him as a fully fledged man of the theatre, as he is one of the 5 sharers who agreed to rent the Swan in early 1597 from Francis Langley. So Jonson's early life gives us an idea of where his genius came from, of how his natural talent and prodigious memory were forged in the Elizabethan school system, before he got something of a taste of the realities of life in the army and as a working guildsman. However, there's also a struggle here, a struggle to find his way, and a sense that as much as we can admire his work, perhaps we wouldn't have liked his company that much. Did he find his way through theatre? With at least one play under his belt by the time he was working at the Swan, it's likely that the other sharers hoped that their actor-playwright would emulate the success of Shakespeare, who by then was producing some very successful works. Some comments by Thomas Nash suggest that an early version of Jonson's comedy The Case is Altered was written for Pembroke's men during their residency at the Swan. It's impossible to say how Jonson saw his career panning out, but he certainly had ideas as a comic playwright, poet and satirist. It was that last part, Jonson the satirist, that was about to lead him into some very big problems. Next time in the narrative timeline, I'll tell you what we know about those events that could have changed the whole history of English theatre, and which cost Jonson and others involved time in prison and quite possibly some torture by one of the Privy Council's most notorious henchmen. But before then, I have a guest episode for you where I get the chance to discuss cue sheets, the actors' scripts that only showed the cues and dialogue for one character, and I get to do that in more detail than previously mentioned on the podcast. My guest uses cue sheets for productions of Shakespeare now, so not only do we get to discuss how cue sheets might have been used by Elizabethan actors, but also we can talk about the practical experience of using them now and what they bring to a performance. In the meantime, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or X just to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. You can find details of ways to support the podcast at the website, which is www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com. That's also a great place to get in touch with me if you wish by using the contact form, or you could even leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon. I look forward to your company next time, but if you do have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can also contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or via X at thoetp.